I never intended to ruin my brother-in-law's life. When you survive actual combat, an arrogant man in a suit barely registers. Marcus's fatal mistake was not calling me a little army secretary. It was hacking a top-secret defense network to feed his jealousy. He wanted to unmask me but opened the gates of hell instead. Now I hold the only key saving him from federal prison. It all started with a 3-star general's shocked stare. Hello, everyone. Before today's story begins, we'd like to share a quick message. YouTube recently removed our monetization, cutting off our income. If you enjoy this story, we humbly ask for just $1 to help pay our staff so they can make a living and keep creating for you. Thank you for saving us. Now, let's begin the story. My name is Gianna Nichols. I am 36 years old, and I have learned through harsh experience that silence is the heaviest weapon in any room. Most people look at me and see a quiet woman with a polite smile. If they look closer, they might notice the thin, faded white lines tracing up my forearms, blending into my skin like old secrets. But people like my husband's family never look that closely. To them, I am just an administrative worker. I tell them I work for the Aegis Protocol Directorate, a government agency with a name so aggressively boring that it immediately shuts down any further questions. They assume I shuffle papers, file reports, and stare at a computer screen from 9 in the morning to 5 in the evening. I let them believe it. Tonight, we were seated in the private dining room of one of the most exclusive steakhouses in Dallas, Texas. It was a lavish birthday dinner for my mother-in-law. The air in the room was thick with the suffocating scent of expensive cologne, roasted bone marrow, and relentless civilian vanity. The conversation flowing around the mahogany table was a continuous loop of financial bragging. They talked about offshore accounts, summer homes in Aspen, and stock yields, desperately trying to validate their worth through the price tags of their possessions. I sat quietly, cutting my steak, my back instinctively facing the wall, my eyes unconsciously tracking the exit routes and the body language of the waitstaff. You can take the soldier out of the war, but the hypervigilance never really fades. The ringleader of this circus was Marcus. He was my brother-in-law, a hedge fund manager whose ego was vastly out of proportion to his actual capabilities. Marcus was the kind of man who viewed every social gathering as a stage where he had to be the undisputed star. He wore a custom suit that probably cost $5,000, yet he wore it like armor to hide his deep-seated insecurities. As the dinner dragged on, my silence began to irritate him. In Marcus's world, if you were not boasting, you were losing, and he could not stand the fact that I was completely immune to his performance. He swirled his wine, leaning across the table with a predatory smirk, deciding to make me the target of his entertainment. He knew I had served in the military before transitioning to my current civilian life. To a man who spent his life moving imaginary money on screens, military service was either a blockbuster movie or a joke. "You know, Gianna," Marcus started, his voice loud enough to command the attention of the entire table. "You are always so quiet over there. It makes me wonder what you actually learned during your time in the uniform, before you got that cushy desk job at the directorate. I mean..." The table grew quiet. My husband shifted uncomfortably, about to interject, but I gently placed a hand on his knee under the table to stop him. Marcus chuckled, sensing he had the audience in the palm of his hand. "Honestly, what was your rank? Were you an army secretary making coffee for the real soldiers, keeping the break room tidy?" A chorus of polite, condescending laughter erupted around the table. My mother-in-law offered a sympathetic but patronizing smile. They looked at me, expecting embarrassment or anger. I felt neither. When you have stared down the barrel of an assault rifle in the darkest, most forsaken corners of the earth, the insults of a soft, arrogant man in a tailored suit do not even register on the radar. I looked at Marcus and smiled. It was not a smile of defeat. It was a smile of profound, chilling pity. However, the laughter did not reach the adjacent table. Sitting just a few feet away was a family enjoying a quiet dinner. At the head of that table sat a man I recognized instantly, even out of uniform. It was retired General Sterling, a 3-star commander who had seen more combat than anyone else in this hemisphere. As Marcus's mocking words echoed through the room, General Sterling froze. His fork clattered against his porcelain plate, a sharp sound that pierced the lingering giggles. The general turned his head. His eyes locked onto mine. All the color drained from his weathered face, as if he had just seen a ghost rise from the ashes of a forgotten war zone. He stood up slowly, pushing his chair back. The heavy silence that followed his movement forced my family to turn and stare. General Sterling ignored the confused looks of his own family. He ignored the elite patrons around us. He completely ignored Marcus, treating him as if he were nothing more than a stain on the carpet. The 3-star general walked directly to my chair. He planted his feet, squared his shoulders, and snapped his posture into a rigid, flawless stance of military attention. The temperature in the dining room seemed to drop below freezing as his booming, authoritative voice echoed off the crystal chandeliers. "Are you still using the callsign Brimstone, sir?" The silence that engulfed the private dining room was absolute. General Sterling remained at perfect attention, waiting for my response. I simply offered him a respectful nod and softly replied, "I am retired from that life. General, have a wonderful evening with your family." He nodded back, a silent understanding passing between us, and returned to his table. He never even glanced at Marcus. The damage, however, was already done. The illusion of Marcus's supremacy had been shattered into a million irreparable pieces. For a man who built his entire identity on being the most important person in any room, watching a titan of the military establishment bow to his supposedly inferior sister-in-law was a psychological wound he could not endure. Over the next 3 weeks, his bruised ego mutated into a toxic obsession. Marcus could not accept that there were hierarchies in this world that his hedge fund money could not buy. If he could not be above me, he had to tear me down. He began planting poisonous seeds of doubt during family gatherings. At Sunday brunches and casual get-togethers, when I was not present, he would lean in close to my mother-in-law and whisper his fabricated theories. My husband heard the rumors and furiously relayed them to me. Marcus was implying that my entire military background was a sham. He threw around phrases like stolen valor and dishonorable discharge, suggesting that the general had merely mistaken me for someone else, or worse, that I was a pathological liar covering up a disgraceful past. I told my husband to let it go. The barking of a small dog does not disturb a lion. But Marcus mistook my restraint for guilt. He took my silence as a confession. Driven by a desperate need to expose me and reclaim his position as the family patriarch, he took his crusade to the internet. He spent countless hours scouring public databases, military alumni forums, and government archives. He searched my maiden name, my married name, and any combination of the two. He found absolutely nothing. For someone with my background, a clean digital footprint is not an accident. It is a necessity carefully curated by the Department of Defense. My records were buried behind layers of encryption that did not exist on the public web. To a rational person, this absolute absence of information would be a massive red flag. It would scream that they were digging into territory strictly off-limits to civilians. But Marcus was blinded by his own narcissism. In his twisted logic, the lack of a record was the ultimate proof that I had never done anything of value. Convinced he was on the verge of uncovering the family scandal of the decade, Marcus escalated his game. He decided that if the surface web had no answers, he needed someone who could dig deeper. He hired a private investigator. This was not a seasoned professional with a badge and boundaries. This was an amateur data scraper he found on a dark web forum, a guy willing to perform illegal background checks and hack personal files for a few $1,000s in untraceable currency. Marcus thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess. He did not realize he was bringing a plastic toy to a nuclear standoff. It happened on a rainy Tuesday morning at the Aegis Protocol Directorate. My office was quiet, filled only with the soft hum of cooling servers and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. I was reviewing a routine risk assessment file when a subtle, silent alarm triggered on my secondary monitor. A solid block of crimson red flashed across the black screen, accompanied by a scrolling string of raw data. Someone was attempting to breach my personal employment files. I leaned back in my chair, sipping my black coffee, and watched the attack unfold in real time. It was a brute force attack aimed directly at a level 4 security firewall. The methodology was sloppy, aggressive, and incredibly loud in the digital sense. It took me less than 45 seconds to trace the source back to a proxy server, and from there, to isolate the distinct signature of the amateur hacker. Given the specific files being targeted, it did not take a genius to figure out who was paying the bill. Marcus had actually done it. Standard protocol for a level 4 intrusion requires an immediate hard lock of the system and an automated alert sent to the cybersecurity division for a retaliatory strike. My finger hovered over the enter key to initiate the lockdown. But then, a cold, calculating thought crossed my mind. Marcus wanted a show. He wanted to feel like a master manipulator pulling the strings of my downfall. I pulled my hand back. A slow, chilling smile touched the corners of my mouth. Instead of slamming the door shut, I opened a terminal window and rapidly typed a sequence of override commands. I essentially created a digital honeypot, a fake vulnerability in the outer armor of the system. I gently guided his amateur hacker away from the real classified servers and funneled him into an isolated directory containing fabricated, low-level administrative documents. I sat there and watched the hacker gleefully download the bait. Marcus and his hired gun thought they were brilliantly bypassing a government firewall. They had no idea I was holding the door open for them. More importantly, they were entirely oblivious to the fact that by downloading those specific files, they had just triggered a silent, unerasable tracking algorithm embedded within the data. Marcus thought he was digging up my past, but he had just awakened a sleeping monster that was about to swallow his entire future. Exactly 1 month later, the Texas summer heat was bearing down on us like a physical weight, thick and unforgiving. Marcus was hosting his annual midsummer barbecue at his sprawling multi-million-dollar estate. The backyard was a monument to excessive wealth, featuring an Olympic-sized infinity pool, a fully equipped outdoor kitchen, and manicured lawns that looked like they belonged on a golf course. Family members and a few of his close corporate friends lounged on expensive patio furniture, sipping iced cocktails and enjoying the smell of expensive cuts of meat sizzling on the massive grill. Marcus was practically vibrating with a manic, triumphant energy. He paced around the patio, a predatory gleam in his eyes, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. At precisely 4 o'clock in the afternoon, he decided the stage was set. He tapped a heavy silver grilling tong against a crystal glass, the sharp ringing cutting through the soft jazz playing from the outdoor smart speakers. "Everyone, if I could have your attention for just a moment," Marcus announced, projecting his voice so it echoed across the water of the pool. The chatter died down. Heads turned. He stood at the head of the long outdoor dining table, chest puffed out, holding up a thin, pale manila folder like it was a hard-won trophy. "We are all about honesty in this family," Marcus began, his gaze fixing entirely on me. "And for a while now, there has been a certain narrative floating around about Gianna, a narrative involving top-secret heroics and highly classified military operations." He let out a condescending scoff. "Well, I do not like mysteries, and I certainly do not like being lied to in my own home. So, I took it upon myself to do a little digging. I hired a specialist. It cost me nearly $10,000, but the truth is always worth the price." He dramatically flipped the folder open, pulling out a small stack of freshly printed papers. "Right here, I have her actual service record, retrieved directly from the deepest archives. And guess what? There are no medals for valor. There is no classified combat history. According to these documents, Gianna was exactly what I said she was: a low-level logistics administrator, a glorified supply clerk who managed inventory and filed paperwork." He looked around at the guests, soaking in their surprised whispers. "She has been playing us all for fools." Beside me, my husband's entire body went rigid. The air around him seemed to ignite. With a sudden, violent scrape of metal against stone, he shoved his chair back and stood up, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles turned entirely white. He was a second away from launching himself across the table to tear his brother apart. I did not stand. I did not even raise my voice. I simply reached out and clamped my hand around my husband's wrist. My grip was absolute iron, locking his arm in place. I did not look up at his furious face. My eyes were completely glued to Marcus's expensive smartphone, which was resting flat on the granite countertop next to the manila folder. "Gianna, let me go," my husband growled through gritted teeth. "Sit down," I whispered, my voice carrying a strange, hollow echo that made him freeze. Right at that exact second, the soft jazz music abruptly stopped. A sharp, ear-piercing burst of static crackled through the expensive outdoor speakers, making several guests flinch and cover their ears. Then, the true nightmare began. Marcus's smartphone screen suddenly flashed violently, turning completely black. The massive flat-screen television visible inside the living room through the sliding glass doors did the exact same thing. Every single tablet, smartwatch, and digital display within a 100-foot radius simultaneously dropped off the local network. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the black screens flickered back to life, but they no longer displayed their usual interfaces. Instead, every single screen glowed with a harsh, blood-red digital countdown timer. It started at precisely 3 minutes and 0 seconds. It was ticking down in absolute, terrifying synchronization. Marcus stopped smiling. He dropped the tongs, staring down at his phone in utter confusion. "What the hell is this? Did the Wi-Fi router crash?" He tapped his screen frantically, but the red numbers just kept ticking. 2 minutes and 50 seconds. I picked up my silver fork, casually speared a small piece of smoked brisket from my plate, and took a slow, deliberate bite. The silence in the backyard was now deafening, broken only by the ambient hum of the pool pump. "Your router is fine, Marcus," I said, my voice cutting through the heavy air with cold, surgical precision. "But that piece of paper you are holding is not what you think it is. You did not pay $10,000 for my service record. You paid for a ghost file." Marcus looked up, his face pale, his bravado rapidly draining away. "What are you talking about?" "That document contains an embedded digital watermark," I explained smoothly, taking a sip of water. "It is a specialized tracking protocol designed by federal intelligence agencies. When your amateur hacker illegally bypassed the outer firewall of the Aegis Protocol Directorate and downloaded that specific file, he did not just steal a document, he downloaded a beacon." I leaned forward slightly, resting my forearms on the table. "He did not find my records, Marcus. He walked blindly into a honey trap, and the moment he transmitted that file to your personal network so you could print it out for this pathetic little show, you triggered a highly classified alarm. The countdown timers across the house hit 2 minutes and 0 seconds. You did not hire a private investigator," I continued, my tone lowering into something much darker. "You initiated an unauthorized digital breach on a restricted government network. You just activated the automated response grid of the Cyber Counterterrorism Task Force." Marcus let out a loud, forced bark of laughter. It was a desperate sound, laced with rising panic. "You are insane. You expect me to believe this Hollywood garbage? You are just trying to scare me because I exposed you." He pointed an accusatory finger at me, ready to launch into another tirade. He never got the chance. Before he could speak another word, a low, heavy vibration began to rattle the crystal glasses on the tables. The water in the pool started to ripple, vibrating with microscopic tremors. A massive, unnatural shadow suddenly swept over the pristine lawn, blocking out the late afternoon sun. The low vibration rapidly escalated into a deafening, rhythmic thumping that rattled the teeth in our skulls. The guests screamed, diving for cover as the sheer force of a massive downdraft hit the patio. Lawn chairs were violently thrown across the yard. Paper plates and napkins whipped through the air like a localized hurricane. Marcus stumbled backward, shielding his face from the flying debris, his eyes wide with a terror he had never known. Hovering barely 50 feet above his extravagant backyard was a massive matte black tactical helicopter. It had no identifying numbers, no military insignia, just dark, tinted windows and the terrifying silhouette of heavily armed personnel leaning out of the side doors, their rifles trained directly on the property. The countdown on the screens hit 0. For the next 96 hours, Marcus lived in a state of suffocating, unspoken paranoia. The unmarked tactical chopper had not landed at his barbecue. It had merely circled his property for 3 agonizing minutes, its heavy downdraft tearing his manicured yard to shreds, before banking sharply and disappearing into the Texas horizon. It was a calculated intimidation tactic, a physical verification scan triggered by his digital footprint. Yet, instead of recognizing the sheer magnitude of his peril, Marcus chose absolute denial. His fragile ego simply could not process the reality that he had made a fatal error. He convinced his guests, and desperately tried to convince himself, that it was a bizarre training exercise or an overreaction by some automated local flight control system. To mask his underlying terror and reassert his dominance, he plunged obsessively into the final preparations for his annual charity gala. It was a multi-million-dollar event sponsored by his hedge fund, ostensibly to support veterans, but designed entirely to polish his corporate image and prove to the world that he was an untouchable pillar of the community. While he was busy screaming at event planners over the placement of ice sculptures, the secure line in my office rang. I was deep inside the reinforced basement level of the directorate. The incoming caller identification showed nothing but a randomized alphanumeric string, but the voice that came through the receiver was unmistakable. "Brimstone, we have a critical situation," General Sterling said, his tone heavy and devoid of any pleasantries. "A federal arrest warrant has just been expedited and signed by a federal judge. The primary charge is the intentional theft of national secrets, accompanied by severe cyber espionage." I leaned back in my chair, staring at the blank concrete wall. "Are they moving on him now?" "They are staging the assault teams as we speak," Sterling confirmed, his voice dropping an octave. "Your past as the captain of the highly classified explosive ordnance disposal and tactical rescue team is buried under a Level 5 security clearance for a reason. There are still active operatives embedded overseas who rely on that specific network architecture remaining entirely dark. Your brother-in-law's reckless digital intrusion did not just trigger a local firewall. It threatened the integrity of a live intelligence web. The government does not issue warnings for this kind of breach. They eradicate the threat." The silence hanging on the secure line was immense. I knew exactly what a federal indictment of this magnitude meant. Marcus was looking at a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a maximum security penitentiary. His assets would be frozen and seized immediately. His lucrative firm would instantly collapse. But more importantly, the collateral damage would utterly destroy my husband's family. My mother-in-law would not survive the public disgrace, and my husband would be completely torn apart by the fallout. I stood at a crossroads. I could easily sit back, do absolutely nothing, and watch the federal government bury the arrogant man who had relentlessly tormented me. It would be entirely effortless, but I could not let innocent people become collateral damage in his pathetic war. I had to step out of the shadows to save an abuser from his own monumental stupidity. "Hold the tactical strike teams," I told General Sterling, my voice steady. "Give me exactly 1 hour." That evening, I prepared for a battle that required no conventional weapons. I chose a floor-length black evening gown, elegant but subtly restrictive, forcing me to move with deliberate, measured grace. Before stepping out of my bedroom, I carefully inserted a micro-communication device deep into my left ear canal, hiding it entirely beneath my hair. It was an encrypted audio channel linked directly to the federal agents currently surrounding the hotel perimeter. I checked my reflection one last time. I was no longer playing the part of a quiet civilian wife. I was a commander walking directly into a hostile zone. When my husband and I arrived at the grand ballroom of the downtown luxury hotel, the atmosphere was suffocatingly opulent. Massive crystal chandeliers bathed the room in a warm, golden glow. Hundreds of influential politicians, billionaire investors, and high-ranking military officials mingled, holding expensive champagne flutes. At the front of the massive hall, standing behind a polished mahogany podium, was Marcus. He looked incredibly smug in his bespoke tuxedo, entirely oblivious to the invisible crosshairs resting squarely on his chest. His voice boomed through the state-of-the-art sound system as he delivered a passionate, perfectly rehearsed speech about his deep, unwavering respect for the armed forces. He spoke loudly about sacrifice and honor, cynically throwing around patriotic buzzwords to farm applause from the wealthy crowd. Watching him play the noble benefactor, knowing he had actively tried to destroy a veteran out of pure spite just days prior, made my blood run entirely cold. The stage was perfectly set. My entrance into the ballroom did not go unnoticed. Marcus, from his elevated vantage point at the polished mahogany podium, immediately spotted my husband and me navigating through the dense sea of designer dresses and tailored tuxedos. A wicked, triumphant gleam ignited in his eyes the second he saw me. He had spent the last 10 minutes preaching about his immense dedication to the armed forces, basking in the polite applause of the city's wealthy elite. But seeing me standing quietly near the front tables presented an opportunity his venomous ego simply could not resist. He decided it was the perfect moment to deliver his finishing blow, to publicly humiliate me in front of the most powerful people in the state and cement his absolute dominance over our family dynamic. Marcus leaned intimately into the microphone, his voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that echoed off the high, gilded ceiling. "Ladies and gentlemen, speaking of service, we actually have a veteran among us tonight, my own sister-in-law." He gestured grandly in my direction, forcing the heavy spotlight of hundreds of eyes to pivot toward me. She spent years doing the essential, unsung work of the military. In fact, since we are preparing to record the massive financial pledges from our generous donors tonight, I think we need the best organizational skills available. Gianna, why do you not come up to the front and take the donation minutes for us? After all, you are the absolute best Army Secretary I know. A heavy, suffocating silence descended upon the grand hall. It was not a silence of awe, but of profound, uncomfortable confusion. The wealthy patrons exchanged bewildered glances. Publicly reducing a family member to a clerical punchline at a high-profile charity gala was a massive breach of high society etiquette. My husband stiffened violently beside me, a low growl forming deep in his throat, but I remained perfectly still, my expression an unreadable mask of absolute calm. Before the awkward murmurings of the crowd could fully materialize into whispers, the heavy oak double doors at the rear of the ballroom burst open with a resounding, thunderous crack. Every head in the massive room snapped toward the entrance. Standing in the threshold was General Sterling, the highly anticipated guest of honor and keynote speaker for the evening. He was dressed in his immaculate, full military dress uniform. Rows upon rows of shimmering medals and ribbons adorned his broad chest, each one representing a terrifying crucible of combat and sacrifice. He radiated an aura of raw, undeniable authority that instantly dwarfed Marcus's expensive custom suit and hollow bravado. Marcus immediately seized the moment to recover the awkward room, projecting a wide, sycophantic smile. "Ah, General Sterling, what an absolute honor. Please, join me up here on the stage." The general did not acknowledge Marcus. He did not even look at the podium. Instead, Sterling began a slow, deliberate march down the central aisle of the ballroom. The sea of billionaires, state senators, and socialites instinctively parted for him, holding their breath as his polished shoes struck the marble floor in a heavy, rhythmic cadence. He bypassed the VIP tables. He bypassed the stage stairs entirely. He walked directly to where I stood. When he was exactly 3 paces away from me, General Sterling stopped abruptly. He squared his massive shoulders, snapped his heels together with a sharp crack, and executed a flawless, razor-sharp military salute. He held it with absolute, unwavering rigidity. The collective gasp from the hundreds of guests sucked all the remaining oxygen out of the room. To see a legendary, three-star commander initiate a salute to an ununiformed civilian woman was a sight that shattered their entire understanding of the world's hierarchy. I returned a crisp nod, a silent acknowledgement of his immense respect. Only then did the general lower his hand. A nearby event coordinator, trembling with sudden anxiety, rushed forward and handed Sterling a wireless microphone. The general gripped the microphone tightly, turning slowly to face the bewildered crowd, and finally, he cast a withering, disgust-filled glare up at the podium. "She is not a secretary," General Sterling boomed, his gravelly voice hitting the back walls with the force of an artillery shell. "And she certainly never made coffee for anyone. This woman standing before you is Tactical Commander Brimstone. 8 years ago, my transport convoy was ambushed and pinned down in a lethal kill zone in Kandahar. We were entirely surrounded, taking heavy casualties, and massive enemy fire made extraction mathematically impossible. When local Air Support Command declared it a suicide mission and ordered all rescue units to stand down, Commander Brimstone defied those orders. She piloted a heavily damaged extraction bird directly into a literal sea of fire, suppressing enemy positions single-handedly, and dragged me and 14 of my bleeding soldiers out of the jaws of certain death when absolutely no one else dared to take off." General Sterling took a massive step closer to the stage, pointing a thick, calloused finger directly at the man trembling behind the podium. "She carries more honor, more courage, and more American blood on her hands in the defense of this nation than you could possibly comprehend in 10 lifetimes of moving paper money around, you pathetic little man." Marcus stood absolutely petrified. The smug, triumphant smile had completely vanished, replaced by a ghastly, translucent pallor. All the blood had drained entirely from his face. He looked like a man who had just been forcefully pushed out of an airplane without a parachute. Slowly, a solitary clapping sound began to echo from one of the front tables. A highly decorated Marine colonel had stood up. Then, a prominent state senator joined him. Within 10 seconds, the entire ballroom of over 500 elite guests was on its feet, delivering a deafening, thunderous standing ovation directed entirely at me. The applause crashed over the room like a tidal wave of reverence, entirely drowning out Marcus's pathetic, shattered reality. He had tried to bury me in front of the world, but he had inadvertently built me a monument. But the applause was merely the prelude to his ultimate destruction. My earpiece crackled softly with a single, sharp voice from the federal command post outside. "Strike team moving in." The nightmare Marcus had carelessly awakened was finally here. While the crowd was still cheering wildly, the heavy side doors of the grand ballroom swung open simultaneously. Men and women wearing sharp black suits and dark tactical earpieces marched into the room. They moved with a terrifying, synchronized efficiency that instantly signaled an absolute lack of mercy. There were 12 of them in total, federal agents of the highest operational tier. They ignored the cheering crowd entirely. Their cold, predatory eyes locked securely on one single target. They flanked the center aisle and moved directly toward the brightly lit stage where the arrogant hedge fund manager stood entirely frozen, watching the devastating consequences of his unimaginable arrogance marching right up the stairs to claim him. The applause was still ringing in the cavernous space when the lead federal agent reached the podium. He did not hesitate. He grabbed Marcus by the shoulder, spinning him around with brutal efficiency, and slammed him face first onto the polished mahogany wood. The sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs echoing through the microphone sent a shockwave of dead silence across the room. "Marcus, you are under arrest for a high-level national data breach and unauthorized penetration of classified defense networks," the agent announced. His voice was entirely devoid of emotion. Flashbulbs from the hired press photographers suddenly erupted, capturing the humiliating spectacle. Marcus writhed against the heavy grip of the federal operatives. His perfectly styled hair fell into his face, and his bespoke tuxedo jacket bunched up awkwardly around his shoulders. He was completely stripped of his dignity in front of the very people he had spent his entire life trying to impress. "Wait! There is a mistake!" Marcus shrieked, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. He scrambled his eyes across the audience, desperately searching for a lifeline. Senator, tell them who I am. I run the biggest fund in this city. We play golf every weekend." The state senator simply turned his back, taking a slow sip of his champagne. "Bill, you know the governor? Call the governor." Marcus pleaded toward a billionaire tech executive in the front row. The executive actively stepped backward, shielding his wife from the scene, treating Marcus like he was infected with a highly contagious disease. Nobody wanted to be associated with federal treason. Wealth could buy many things, but it could not buy salvation from a national security indictment. Realizing his powerful connections were completely abandoning him, Marcus completely shattered. His legs gave out. If the agents had not been holding him up, he would have face-planted onto the stage. He looked past the agents, locking eyes with my husband, tears streaming down his face. "Please help me do something." I placed a gentle hand on my husband's arm, signaling him to stay put. Slowly, I began to walk toward the stairs of the stage. Every eye in the massive room tracked my movement. The silence was so profound you could hear the soft rustle of my long evening gown brushing against the carpet. I climbed the steps with measured, deliberate grace, projecting an aura of absolute control. I stopped inches away from the trembling man. I reached into my small clutch purse and pulled out my official credentials. I held up a solid black card with a thick gold border, bearing the deep, iridescent seal of the Aegis Protocol Directorate. Under the bright stage lights, it looked less like an identification badge and more like a decree of absolute authority. I turned to the man in charge of the extraction team. "Agent Davis," I said, my voice cold, carrying an unmistakable weight of command. "Let him go." Agent Davis paused, looking at the seal on my credentials. "He is an arrogant idiot, not a foreign spy," I stated firmly, my gaze never leaving the agent. "I will take full responsibility for the internal clearance and sign off on the threat assessment. Release him." Agent Davis did not argue. He did not ask for further verification. He simply nodded respectfully, pulled a small key from his tactical vest, and unlocked the heavy steel cuffs. "Yes, Commander," he replied. He gave a quick hand signal to his squad. Within 10 seconds, the entire team of federal operatives retreated down the side aisles and vanished through the exit doors, leaving the room exactly as fast as they had entered. The sudden departure of the strike team left a void on the stage. Marcus collapsed onto his hands and knees. He was gasping for air, weeping openly, a broken, pathetic shell of a man kneeling in a puddle of his own destroyed ego. In that singular moment, a devastating realization washed over him. He finally understood that his life, his lucrative career, and his freedom were not guaranteed by his massive bank accounts or his country club memberships. They were granted entirely by the mercy of the quiet secretary he had relentlessly mocked. I crouched down, bringing my face level with his. He flinched, expecting violence. Instead, I leaned in close, ensuring the microphone could not pick up my words, and whispered directly into his ear. "The difference between you and me, Marcus, is that you have to push everyone else down just to feel like you are great," I murmured softly, letting the absolute coldness of my voice pierce his soul. "I just have to snap my fingers to decide whether you have the right to exist. Never ask about my rank again." I stood up smoothly, turning my back on him without a second glance. I walked down the stairs, took my husband's arm, and together we exited the grand ballroom. We left Marcus kneeling completely alone under the blinding spotlights, utterly ruined by the very stage he had built to destroy me. Thank you so much for listening to today's story. We hope you enjoyed it, as an ad-free channel. Your support is what keeps us alive. Please support Maya Revenge Stories with just $1 via the QR code on the screen, or click the link in the description box or pinned comment. Also, we would love to connect with you. Please leave a comment. telling us which city or state you are listening from. Thank you for standing with us, and see you in the next stories.